So hello everybody, buenas tardes a todos. Vamos a esperar unos minutos, unos segundos para empezar, antes de empezar este webinar, para dar un poco de tiempo y todo el mundo se pueda conectar. Vale, yo creo que podemos empezar. So, buenas tardes a todos. Good afternoon and many thanks for joining us. I'm Joseph Palos. I'm a researcher here from the Mediterranean Institute for Advanced Studies. The IMEDEA is a joint research institute between the Spanish National Research Council and the University of the Balearic Islands. With our main aims are producing scientific and technical knowledge about the structure and function of the nature and how it responds to the human activities. Here at IMEDEA, we are celebrating our 25th anniversary. And among other different activities, we are organizing a webinar series about what are the new frontiers of transdisciplinary research in natural systems. This webinar series will be extended to the next year, and we are inviting the most influencing authors on the topic. And today is a tremendous honor for me to introduce as the first speaker of this webinar series, Professor Robert Arlinghaus. Robert is an interdisciplinary fisheries scientist working on social ecological problems applied to natural systems, with a special emphasis on recreational and small-scale fisheries. Robert studied fish ecology and fisheries at Humboldt University in Berlin, and since 2013 is full professor for integrative fisheries management at Humboldt University and at the Leibniz Institute for Freshwater Ecology and Inland Fisheries in Berlin. Robert is author of more than 550 publications and about 250 peer-reviewed publications and many different books, including publications in the most important multidisciplinary journals like Science, PNAS, Ecology Letters. He has received numerous awards for his inter and transdisciplinary work on sustainable fisheries, including the Award of Excellence in Fisheries Management and Outreach Award by the American Fisheries Society, the Cultura Prize by the Alfred Topfer Foundation for exceptional contributions to the sustainable land use, and recently the Communicator Award by the German Science Foundation. Robert is editor of leading journals on fisheries science like Fish and Fisheries, and he's very active on social media, where you can follow him in Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I strongly recommend you visit his webpage, ifishman.de, for looking and following his inspiring work. Robert has been a real inspiration for many of early career researchers working on recreational fisheries, on fish ecology, and social ecological approaches to natural systems, including myself. Robert is also an enthusiastic speaker. I'm pretty sure all of the audience will enjoy this webinar today. And remember that you can ask questions, Robert, in the chat of the YouTube, and I will translate the questions to Robert at the end of the presentation. So thanks, Robert, to accept our invitation to give us this seminar, and take your time.
Muchas gracias, Pep. Thanks, Pep, for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here and speak to you. It's also a little bit unusual because I'm actually just seeing Pep. I have no idea how many people are following over there. So it will be an adventure. I will tell Pep the story I want to share with you today. So let me check or do the screen sharing for now. So I was asked to give an overview a little bit of our work where we use the transdisciplinary research approach in a natural resource management context. So I'm going to give you a little background on what transdisciplinary research means. And because of my specialty, I will mainly give examples then of recreational fisheries, where we actually applied in a large team of postdocs, technicians, master students, and PhD students, transdisciplinary work over multiple years with stakeholders. And at the end, I will try to summarize and give you a few lessons that we got on the usefulness of this approach to deal with natural resource management problems. So basically, we are facing a massive crisis in natural resources. All over the world, humans are heavily interacting with natural resources, and some people like Johan Röckström and Stefan and so on, who coined the term of planetary boundaries, are convinced that we have already crossed a few of these boundaries in terms of biodiversity decline and other issues. We do live in an Anthropocene. Humans are strongly impacting and directing ecosystems and the ecosphere. And we are seeing rapid declines in biodiversities, not only in aquatic, but also terrestrial biodiversity. We are seeing habitat simplification, the loss of ecosystems, spread of invasive species, climate change, overfishing, and the list can go on and on and on. So we have sustainability issues, particularly on natural resources. And we do have them despite having all that scientific knowledge that should teach us about things, how to do things better. So that's the phenomenon. We have a huge crisis. At the same time, unprecedented knowledge about how ecosystems work, how natural resources work, and how we could actually keep things on a sustainable trajectory. So the big question is, why are we not using this knowledge effectively? And one possibility is maybe we are doing the science related to the environment in a wrong or not so appropriate way. And an idea is, could be transdisciplinary research a solution to addressing at least some of these problems? So what is transdisciplinary research? It's defined, according to us, as a joint learning process between science and society. And it's meant to tackle problems that matter to people on the ground in a very concrete context. So it's research that is contextualized to address local or regional sustainability problems. Why is this a good way? Because you can include the wealth of knowledge, maybe also sustainability solutions that people on the ground have. And people on the ground shall also be included in the process to better define the research questions and to structure the problem that science is then meant to solve. So it's not only in academia where problems are defined in research, but actually the stakeholders become part of the definition of the problem and the solutions. And it's a good way to do so because, and to involve the people, because we can deal with their normative views, how the solutions and the world should be. And this increases the acceptability of solutions, it increases ownership, and of course fosters learning, not just in the academic environment, but also in those people that interact with the natural resources, such as fishers or anglers. So transdisciplinarity in one term might mean, there are many definitions of it, but this is how I mean it, it's science done in partnership with people on sustainability problems that matter to people. And as you have seen, I'm using the word people here a lot. I'm not using the word stakeholder so much, because it's actually not just an interest group out there, it's actually the resources are often owned and used by people on the ground. So they're not just the stakeholder that work with us as a scientist, but they're actually key people out there that actually have the problems that we want to help them solve. So the idea of transdisciplinary research is actually to develop a triangle of objectives. The first one is to generate proper system knowledge. This is what we academics are always interested in. We want to really understand how processes work, how mechanisms work, how developments of natural resources work, for example. So this is the core area of scientific inquiry. However, transdisciplinary research also wants to foster and deal with target knowledge. So which objectives do people outside of academia have about natural resources? How are those objectives defined? how are they used in moral arguments? That's the evaluation component that we need to address. And finally, transdisciplinary research does not only want to describe problems, but helps in solutions, so to transform the knowledge into the practical world and to actually identify conditions under which transformation can happen. So how do I move from a desired state that is defined to from the status quo to a desired state? And actually that is something that transdisciplinary research wants to address. In that sense, the way I talk about transdisciplinary research is substantially different from the classical idea of citizen science, because the classical idea of citizen science essentially is a very receptive or maybe a consultative combination or interaction with people on the ground. Very often citizen scientists are only used in parentheses for generating data that the scientist is interested in. The transdisciplinary research I'm talking about really moves along information consultation towards participation, ultimately leading to empowerment of people and actually co-learn about solutions for sustainability, for example, sustainable fisheries, between the stakeholders and the scientists. And the key issue for us as a scientist is really in this interaction, how to deal with normative questions. Because we all have values and the stakeholders and the people will have their own values and they will have perhaps ideas that deviate from our own ideas as an academic. But that's actually the challenge to put this into place and we have to deal with if we engage in that game of transdisciplinary research. Now I want to give you a case study after the introduction that actually applied these principles in my own research, and it's a team of big people. It's a big project that we run over 6 years overall, and it deals with a study case of using a certain fisheries management practice that is very dominant in inland fisheries, but it's also discussed in marine fisheries, particularly coastal fisheries, and that's the practice of actually dealing with resource declines in fish stocks by adding new fish that are either coming from hatcheries or that are caught elsewhere and then brought to the target system. So it's the practice of fish stocking, and it's very, very, very prominent, especially in inland fisheries. And our question is very fundamental. Is this practice work? Does it work and produce benefits to humans? At what environmental cost? For example, if there's flying fish here out of the plane here in the US, there might be diseases that you bring into an ecosystem. It might also be non-native genotypes that you bring into new ecosystem and you lose biodiversity when these newly stocked fish interbreed with the wild components. So what are the costs of stocking? How can we best learn, both scientifically, but also the practitioners, about the success and failures of stocking, not in the computer and not in a lab experiment, but actually under natural conditions in the wild where actually the practice is happening. And perhaps if we jointly have identified issues with the practice, how can we transform it? Fish stocking, to me, was a very fundamental example of a sustainability problem by which we study from a transdisciplinary perspective. It's very interesting, particularly in Germany, because the decision to stock is done by people on the ground, actually by recreational fishing clubs who are owners of lakes and river sections. So it's not a government agency that decides on this practice. It's actually people on the ground. So they affect which fish are stocked, which sizes are stocked, from which environment are those stocked fish coming. So there is an interaction between people, between a natural ecosystem and a technical ecosystem, such as aquaculture, which creates a lot of interesting dynamics. Secondly, the decision to stock is obviously socially constructed. It's happening in local communities. How anglers see the world will affect how the decision maker, who is also an angler, will decide. It's also really hard to monitor, right? So it's very poorly monitored activity. So the knowledge about how stocking works is actually scientifically also pretty poor, because it's really hard to track fish in the wild, particularly in large ecosystems. And thirdly, there's a very ample sustainability debate, at least in our environment, about the ecological risks of stocking. You introduce perhaps new genotypes, non-native fishes might come on board as a passenger in the stocking truck, and there's very uncertain outcomes. And to us, this was a great example by which we could design experiments that involve anglers and conduct experiments together with them, so we could develop learning about how stocking works, when it does not work, what the risks are, and how we move forward in the future. Now, let's have a look at the ecological hypotheses that can happen. So imagine you are a local angler community that manage a local lake, and you have a wild fish stock that you want to raise, for example, dorada in Mallorca, for example. Yeah? Now, but let's think about a lake. So what can happen if the stocking truck introduces new fish? Well, first of all, many anglers will say, yes, you know, I have money, I have a license, and it's so obvious that adding new fish is a good thing, isn't it? It should elevate the stock size. If it does elevate the stock size, so you have more fish after the stocking than before, that's what we all want. We call this an additive effect of stocking. It's a stock enhancing contribution. That's the goal, for the anglers at least. It could, however, also be that these newly introduced fish have an adaptation problem. They are maybe not adapted to the local ecological conditions. They might be poorer competitors to the wild conspecifics. Fish-eating birds might like those newly introduced fish because they don't know where the refugees are. So it might be a complete waste of money, a lack of establishment. A third scenario, however, is that you indeed find a few of those stocked fish, but they are not enhancing the local population, but simply replacing fish that would otherwise grow into the stock by natural recruitment. And that is the condition that we really want to identify. Does stocking increase the stock or simply replace wild fish? If it does the latter, it would be waste of money first, and secondly, ecologically super risky. And now you can imagine how difficult it is to separate these hypotheses, because you need before-after data at least, or in an ideal case, replicated systems where you actually can identify also temporal changes in the fish stocks, right? So you really need large-scale experiments with replication at the scale of natural systems to identify under which condition it works and it doesn't. And that is where we scientists also need to learn, because there are actually quite few replicated whole ecosystem experiments on fish stocking in the world. However, when you ask people, local anglers, about the functionality and outcomes of stocking, the picture is clear. Everybody thinks it works, and the anglers in our German environment also think it's their role to stock fish. So for example, these are over 1,000 anglers that we surveyed. You have agreement to disagreement on a few of these statements, and 84% of the German anglers say that they are convinced that stocking is generally successful. There's also the 91% that say, as anglers, we are responsible to contribute to the maintenance of fish stock by means of stocking. So in other words, people really believe it works, first, and secondly, they think it's part of their DNA. It's part of their way of being an angler to support stocking. Now, we then did a huge social survey in over 1,500 German angling clubs to study what are the actual determinants of stocking decisions. What drives how many fish in kilograms per hectare are released in those local fisheries. We identified a few predictors of this behavior, some of which are very obvious. For example, how big the resource system is. The stocking intensity is much bigger in smaller systems. Clubs that have more money invest more fish. If you have monitoring, you have different impacts. But also, there is this social feedback between anglers and the decision makers. So there's a lot of impact of the belief of people whether stocking works, and the social pressure by the club members to the decision maker is of fundamental importance for the decision. That means how people perceive how the ecosystems work strongly impacts the decisions that are taken in those local communities. So that means these ecological perceptions matter, and not just the perceptions I have as a scientist, but especially the perceptions of the stakeholders. And they will differ, perhaps, but there is, in fact, a first question, how different those perceptions are compared to the perceptions that scientists have. And we did a little study to study this. So essentially, we let a bunch of people actually visualize the knowledge they have in terms of the fish population dynamics. We used pike lucio in Spanish as a case study. So this is just one picture of the cause and effect relationships that one angler in this case sees. So we did this in over 200 people, and we compared that to about 20 researchers that were also asked to visualize how they think the ecological relationships in the pike biology work. And then we compared those two groups of people, how similar their understanding of ecology is. And there is a theory that says, the wisdom of the crowd, that if you ask many, many independent people, then the combined solution about what they think how the world works should be very similar to the truth. And when we do that with our sample of anglers and compare the group understanding about ecological relationships to what scientists think about the same problem, in our case, fish population dynamics of pike, we see that there is a huge performance error that increases the more people are involved in the solution. And what this tells us is that we don't have a congruence of thinking of scientists and of stakeholders. And the more anglers are involved, the dissimilar that solution will be. So we need to find a way to harmonize that knowledge, to learn together, because the scientists speak a different language and think differently about a problem than the stakeholders, at least in the case of fish population dynamics that we study. So we designed a transdisciplinary experiment to make that harmonization between the thinking of the stakeholders, of the people, and also of us scientists to learn whether stocking works or not and under which conditions. And what we actually did is known in the environmental science literature as active adaptive management experiment. In other words, there's uncertainty about how different management options work. In our case, whether stocking produces benefits to fish stocks or not. People disagree on whether it works or not. The scientists say, I don't think it very often works. The anglers are very convinced it works. And in order to address that uncertainty, we should do experiments at the scale of the fishery where all the complexity of dynamics is happening. It would not be useful to do this experiment in the lab or in the computer only. So active adaptive management means to experiment with these options, for example, stocking many fish or small fish or different origins of fish, and then do a monitoring system to learn which one is successful, and then basically learn for the future what is done in the future in the clubs. And this is what we did together with multiple angler communities in Germany over 5 or 6 years and up to 24 different ecosystems where we did this type of experiments to learn together about the condition when it works and when it doesn't. So there were two key research questions. One was an ecological research question. Under which conditions do we get additive effects of stocking? And that's a transdisciplinary active adaptive management approach. And secondly, we embedded our ecological experiment in a social experiment because we also wanted to measure whether transdisciplinary cooperation works, whether it changes how people think and feel about the environment compared to other forms of science communication, more traditional forms of, for example, giving lectures, as I do right now. And we also had placebos to control for these effects. So I'm going to now present you the key ecological outcomes. And again, remember, those were all derived in a participatory research setting on the ground with angling clubs. And then I will tell you the results of the social experiment on the pedagogic effects on the people's heads, so to speak. First, the key hypothesis that we actually developed together with our stakeholders about the outcomes of stocking. And we identified that there are two different conditions under which stocking is conducted. One is with species that are not naturally recruiting in the ecosystem anymore. There's no natural reproduction of that fish. Only survival and growth of the fish determine whether they become catchable. They grow into a harvestable size. And then the more common situation is called stock enhancement, where you have a natural recruiting population, but people think it's too small and they want to increase it. And we would argue that the stock enhancing effects are most likely when natural recruitment is very low or absent. And because fish populations can regulate themselves through density-dependent mortality, we would not expect a lot of positive effects on the stock size when there is natural recruitment, unless the stock fish are really large. So those were the two ecologically motivated hypotheses that we derived, and then we tested in jointly conducted experiments. The first experiment was running in a pond facility. Ponds are drainable systems run by an angler association in northwestern Germany, and we used small little lucios, little pike, that are very often stocked actually in that environment. Actually, the angling club uses this pond facility to raise fish that they stock out into the wild. And we did a more controlled experiment here in the intermediate between lab and the field scale, replicated experiment to test the outcome of stocking of pike fry when there is no natural recruitment or when there is natural recruitment. So we had 4 ponds assigned to each of 3 treatments. In one case, we actually stocked our target fish, so big ripe spawning pike that were actually captured in a nearby canal, into these ponds and wanted them to do their job. So in other words, to reproduce and create a naturally recruiting pike stock. So we had 4 cases where we had natural recruitment, and 4 ponds where we also stocked those fish, and we later also added pike fry. We added prey fish, and these wild fish then produced offspring in this pond. And then we used the very same origin fish, brought them to a hatchery, striped them, and produced little pike that are usually used in the stocking exercises. And we added these reddish fish here to a treatment where we wanted to supplement or complement or enhance the natural recruitment. That was one treatment. And the last one, we did not have a natural stock, but we just added fish. So that's simulating a situation that you don't have any natural recruitment. And we only stocked then adult fish after they were spawned. So there was a little cannibalistic predation pressure. All the conditions were similar, except of the introduction of these newly hatched fish. So these fish were reproduced as this angling club would always do. Fish were striped together, then raised in a sugar jar. We used a little alizarin mark in the otoliths, so we can later differentiate the 2 origins, the wild fish and the stock fish. When we introduced little free-swimming fish into the ponds, they were all the same size. So we captured a few of those wild fish. So we cannot say that there was any size advantage to any of those origins. And this is very important because this is a cannibalistic species. So little size differences matter a lot for survival. When we later drained the ponds and assessed the outcome of the stocking exercise, we found the following picture. Very important, we found a very large year class for the conditions where you only stocked, where there was no natural recruitment. So this culture-based stocking was very successful. When you, however, compare the stock enhancement situation, so you have natural recruitment and you stock fish on top, we did not find any difference in the year class strength that was produced. So both natural recruitment only and the stock enhancement were actually producing the same amount of little pike in the ecosystem. So stock enhancement by itself, at least with pike fry, was completely useless. When we presented and discussed this together with the anglers, they said, you academics, you are nuts. You used too small of a fish. You should take larger fish, and then it will work. And we said, well, we don't know. We don't think it would work, only in certain conditions, but why not test this together in a replicated experiment in the lakes managed by a set of angling clubs? So we chose 5 angling clubs in Lower Saxony in Germany, and we used really nicely sized fish, 20 centimeter pike, so it's still young of the year, but it's a really big fish. We marked them, and we had control lakes where we did not stock, and we had 2 stocking densities. So we had in total 18 lakes that we used, and these lakes also differed in the amount of habitat. suitable for pike. The pike likes vegetation, so we had Germany, habitats, and we used really nicely sized control lakes where we did not stock for the entire duration, and then a low and a high stocking density. We boosted the recruitment by up to 1,000%. So we really introduced a lot of pike into these systems. And what we did is known in ecology as a before-after control impact design. So in other words, you take data before and after the intervention, and you monitor both the treatment lakes where you have stocking and the control lakes. And of course, the monitoring was again done together with the anglers, and we had regular seminars and workshops to see about these outcomes. But what did we find ecologically? Here's the condition. I mean, the stock sizes, the mean stock sizes of pike in these little lakes before stocking. And then we introduced the fish in the fall. And then when we did the first monitoring, we were like, wow, this is a real boost in stock size. But no matter if you have a moderate or a high stocking density, in both cases, it looks like half of the stock now is put on top by the stocking material. However, only 4 months later, when we went back to these lakes, all the lakes had re-equilibrated to the original abundance, and we did not find any statistical effect here. So in other words, some of the fish now in the new population were stocked, but the total stock size was not changed even by an increase of recruitment by 1,000%. So in other words, this is a replacement effect. You did not alter the stock size, but you introduced potentially novel genotypes. You have a risk of disease introduction and so on. A stocking exercise that is absolutely useless from both a fisheries perspective, but also from a conservation perspective, even dangerous. So why did these very nice big pike not survive? Well, it's a common theme in the literature that these newly stocked fish have very low fitness. They have very low survival probability, and we could also measure this here in our case. There are several reasons why that's the case. Local adaptation might be one of them, but it's also simply the act of being transported into a new ecosystem. And there are other adaptations that happen in a fish when you raise them in a hatchery and so on. So there are lots of fitness disadvantages whenever they are forced to compete with a naturally born fish. It seems that the stocked fish often lose. So just as an example to show you here the growth of our pike, again from the pond experiments, here is on the left the growth rates of those little pike when the hatchery fish were separate from the wild fish, and they achieved a similar growth rate. However, when the same sized fish were forced into competition, you see how the growth rate is 50% smaller in the hatchery fish. Again, multiple biological reasons associated. First of all, whenever you put a fish into a hatchery and you breed them, you basically circumvent natural selection. It's not a natural way of partner choice, so that can have even genetic effects. You have rapid domestication effects to that high density hatchery conditions that then have an impact on survival in the wild. And many other processes, epigenetic effects, that we can actually conclude that whenever you have competition with a wild conspecific, and we would expect a very low success probability of stocking, unless the stocking material fish is really, really large, but we didn't test that in our experiments. So after we have now found out a few cases under which stocking works, particularly if there's no natural recruitment, and the many cases when it fails, particularly when there is natural recruitment, the next question is this knowledge about sustainable stocking practices something that the anglers also get? I mean, we scientists learned something, but what about the anglers? And so we did an experiment actually to test how well participation, transdisciplinary cooperation works. To that end, the experiments I just described to you were embedded in what I say is a social experiment. We had 17 angling clubs, 17 angling communities. Each of those clubs has 300 to 400 members, and we allocated them to 3 treatments. 5 clubs were actually the ones that were doing the experiments together with us. I will give you some more detail later. 6 clubs were only passively informed about knowledge about sustainable stocking. So in other words, we gave lectures in a workshop setting, actually a full-day seminar series, like what you would do actually to train those fisheries managers in these local angling clubs normally. It's usually based on seminars that academics like myself would give. And then we had a control group, 6 clubs, who also got seminars, but no content on the domain that we are studying, the learning about sustainable stocking. So I talked about actually other stuff. And then we did again a before-after control social survey, big questionnaires, and you see a picture here before we started that, after we gave the theoretical teaching, and obviously the transdisciplinary gang also got the same content theoretically in a seminar before embarking on the joint conduction of the experiments. Then we did a post-assessment, and after 10 months, a retention assessment. So what was the content of those lectures that I actually gave? So we controlled the teacher effect. It was always me. In the placebo group, there was very little content about stocking, or actually no content at all. We get a little bit of content on fish population dynamics, about general principles of harvest regulations. In the interdisciplinary and the seminar group, we had a 4.5-hour seminar with 3 breaks. Some of the content was the same, but we had a lot of content on the potential risks of stocking, genetic pollution, hybridization, determinants of successful and unsuccessful stocking, and also management principles. So really solid theoretical teaching. There was a handout, people could take it home and so on. So we actually simulated how the normal process of education works by passive consumption of scientific content. And then half of the clubs went into a series of workshops and joint planning and conduction of stocking experiments with model species. We used carp and pike in that case. And we went through a process that is known as adaptive management. So in these different workshops, under moderation, we defined the problem, we identified objectives together, we evaluated criteria, we planned the experiments, and then decided what to do, did it together, and then monitored the results together. And this was a smaller group of people, like maybe 20 to 25 people in each club that volunteered to take part. It's usually the fisheries managers, but also some avid anglers that come into these sessions. This is how it looks like. And we really have an intensive planning process. We analyze the different lakes, what the constraints are, etc. We then do the experiments, and the anglers were, of course, also taking part of the assessments, measuring fish, marking fish, and all of this stuff. And then regularly, we scientists were confronting them with questionnaires, sometimes involving some drugs to improve the interest in contributing. So yes, there was a lot of science in the background to monitor what people were thinking and learning and talking about. So thousands of questionnaires were sent out from Berlin, poor PhD students and technicians here helping out to administer this program. So what did we measure in those questionnaires? Well, we of course measured knowledge, ecological knowledge. Do people learn what biodiversity is, what genetic diversity is, under which conditions stocking works, and so on? Obviously, that was studied. However, we know from psychology that knowledge alone is not enough for changing perspectives and behaviors. So, for example, I might know that smoking is bad for me, but I still continue smoking. So there is this knowledge behavior gap. So we also measured a lot of other domains of human decision-making that we know very strongly affect human behavior, particularly attitudes, the evaluation of an object, or for example, whether I like stocking or not, or the personal norms, so how the world should be. How should the lakes be managed in the future? So we know from environmental psychology that personal norms are really fundamental, very important for driving how people behave. So for example, if an angling club might vote in the future to stop stocking, they would need to have a certain personal norm to achieve that change. Knowledge enough is not enough. It's a contributor, but not enough. So we measured all of that in the questionnaire before, after, and 10 months after the end of the survey to measure retention. So, and then I will show you the result almost at the end in just a few slides. And I chose not to show you data, but to show little color for the different domains that we measured. And the more color you see, the stronger were the effects relative to the placebo control. And you see here that simply theoretically exposing a group of anglers to scientific knowledge has pretty strong effects on knowledge increase. It also alters the beliefs whether stocking works or not, and the attitude towards certain management actions is also changing. Importantly, however, the norm, how the club should manage in the future, was not affected by the theoretical teaching. That's very important. Now, every teacher in the audience, everybody who is a teacher or a professor or so on, also as a student, you know, if I don't interact with my teaching material, well, the bottle gets emptier over time. In other words, you start to forget what was learned initially. And exactly this pattern we found. So lots of color is going away. So the effects were still significant relative to the placebo, but the people have forgotten what they learned in this first semi. Not so in the group where we later have the transdisciplinary interaction, where people saw in their lakes under which conditions you recaptured stockfish, where the stockfish were gone, and all of this. In this treatment, where there was constructivist learning, not only were all these knowledge domains maintained, but importantly, the norm to change fisheries management in the future was substantially developed over time. And it took these 8 months of working together to form a new norm about fisheries management. So that's a very strong effect that we found here. We also can see that the people have completely different behavioral intentions towards stocking. Where you have only passive communication of science, only one change was found. People were actually interested in stocking less pike in the future than they do today. While in the transdisciplinary group, you found a lot of stocking intentions to change towards lower reliance on stocking and a greater acceptance of alternatives to stocking, such as enhancing the habitats or constraining harvesting patterns through regulations. So to conclude, I hope I could show you in the case study, and I will have another conclusion for transdisciplinary research, but in the case study that fish stocking is a dominant tool. It's a DNA of inland fisheries management. It can cure symptoms of fish stocks decline. It can, under certain conditions, produce additive effects and help catch in some situations, particularly under conditions where there's no recruitment anymore of your target fish, for example, because the habitats have been altered by damming or other anthropogenic impacts. The additive effects, in fact, are more likely in the absence of natural recruitment, but the more successful your stocking is then under conditions where there is natural recruitment, the more ecological risks you have because you create population mixing potentially, you introduce diseases and so on. So a success breeds risks trade-off you have to navigate in the stocking. We could also show that transdisciplinary research through co-production of knowledge is feasible. It was a lot of work, but it is feasible to be done in almost 17 clubs overall. And it strongly helped to reduce scientific uncertainty because we had, as a scientist, also many questions under which conditions does stocking work or not. And we could learn a lot ourselves. In addition, we can show that this constructivist learning, this co-production of knowledge, also leaves a substantial pedagogic legacy well beyond the realm of science and can strongly affect how people behave in the future, an effect that we don't see if you only expose people to passive communication of science through seminars. So after we learned this, we engaged a new project, and this just to tell you that we are ongoing with this. So we are currently running another transdisciplinary project, again in angling club. This time over 20 clubs are involved and more than 6,000 anglers, where we don't stock, but we engage in alternatives to stocking. So for example, here, the placement of dead wood to create new structure for the fishes. And it was exciting to see how involved the angler communities are, how able they are to foster networks, to get big machines going, and to actually engage in this experiment to ask, does this habitat enhancement work? And we are currently in the monitoring phase, so I couldn't tell you results because it's an ongoing project. But what I can tell you is that, again, the workshops really worked and people were super engaged. And also some of these anglers were showing leadership qualities. Actually, this is not one of our scientists. That's actually an angling club head that actually takes over and manages this whole process. So whenever you work on an eye level as a scientist and you say, look, I don't know the result either, let's do an experiment together, you will be surprised how easy or how dedicated the people are and how willing they are to do nice experiments that they all so want to know the answer about. The second ongoing project we are doing in the coastal sites around northern Germany, again, a transdisciplinary project where we're actually studying the coastal dynamics of pike, which is also living there in low brackish areas. And again, we have workshop settings where we bring fishers, anglers, agency staff, and other people together to think about scenarios for future management. So based on the experience I have had, and of course that's only my experience, I would argue that it's useful to take transdisciplinary research home and to work with that in your own settings. Because most sustainability problems actually cannot be solved by other means. They demand interdisciplinarity, the linking of social science and biological science, and transdisciplinarity, where you also integrate with stakeholders. And that actually, I think, is key to also increase the acceptability of scientific results and make them relevant to people. So they are actually done in a setting that is ecologically and socially realistic. I totally agree that it's very difficult and demanding to do, particularly keeping people involved, getting their trust, means a lot of years sometimes to develop. And of course, there are some people that are always critical of science. I'm not romanticizing these efforts, but it pays large dividends if properly done. And I do think that it's essential if one is interested in rapid transformative change on the ground. And people are not to be treated just as informants, but as partners on a journey of joint learning. And I do see a large application potential, not just in my little microcosmos of recreational angling in little lakes in Germany, but I do think that in many areas of the world, in fisheries and forestry, agriculture, gardening, hunting, there are many cases where similar projects could be put in place. And I would argue to take the risk and to actually enjoy the process. So with that, I have to wholeheartedly thank the funding of this project. So several million euros went into this, and it was funded by the German Ministry of Education and Research. And I also wholeheartedly want to thank the angler associations and the participating angling clubs and thousands of people actually that were part of these big projects. So this is really also simply the project of them, and I'm just communicating the outcome of the people. And obviously, I need to thank also my team, not in the background, but in the forefront. Again, I'm just a communicator, but there are many, many people here, students, postdocs, technicians, PhD students, master students that have worked multiple years here, and that's really their project. If you're interested in more details, there's a full documentary, 60 minutes on YouTube, which you can look at. And of course, please go through our social media channels if you want to get more details, or simply drop me a line if you're interested. So it's getting night here in Berlin. I actually talked into the night, but that's what I have. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Rory. Very, very inspiring presentation as always. So thank you for giving us this presentation. Yeah, you are not alone. So we were over 70, 80 people watching you. So it was good.
That's good.
Some of them have some problems with the chat. So maybe if the audience just refresh the YouTube, you are able to see the chat, because some of the audience have some problems. Maybe just refreshing the YouTube, you can ask, if you have any questions, you can ask questions to Robert. So a couple of questions from our audience are, okay, this is super nice, transdisciplinary, so working with people. from your experience. So I think your background is on biology, right? But now you are not a biologist anymore. So you are I don't know, you are not a social scientist, you are not a biologist. So what are you, and what are the recommendation for people or researchers like me that comes from ecology, from biology, to reach this umbrella of transdisciplinarity and to reach this idea of applying real transdisciplinarity to natural
very
systems?
Very important point, because I have made my experiences here as well, and I do think I have a few critical remarks or cautionary notes. So first of all, on the career perspective, I mean, my academic development is very unusual, perhaps. Yeah, I have been an aquatic ecologist, as you know, by training, and it was simply coincidence that I got a position to do socioeconomic survey work with recreational anglers.
Yeah.
An angler all my life. Suddenly there was this job, oh, I could do work on recreational anglers, but you have to do socioeconomics. I had absolutely no clue what that is. So that maybe for me was a chance, because it was simply the 3 or 4 years of work where I could learn a certain method skill set, doing surveys, for example, and learning the theory of economics a little bit and a little bit of social science. And so simply I was forced to learn that myself for my PhD. And you know, I had very good supervisors that I chose simply in the US and so on. And after the PhD, I was suddenly realizing, oh, okay, now I have a solid method understanding for doing surveys, but I can also speak to my fellow ecologist friends because I still remember what a fish is. So in that sense, maybe it was unusual. I was not trained academically as an interdisciplinary scientist, but I was really always fired up by recreational angling, and suddenly I was able to learn, you know, speak the vocabulary of at least 2 disciplines. And then that's what I think the message is. You have to become really good as a scientist in one discipline. I think it's not good to be interdisciplinary too early. You know, become a good scientist, and which normally means a discipline. But then if you have a personality to say, hey, I'm interested also beyond my reach, if you get the chance to learn the language a little bit of other disciplines, then you can become somebody who builds bridges. So I'm not saying that I'm administering genetics and, you know, telemetry and whatever, but I know enough to then be able to form teams to bring in real experts that are able to do this methodological depth, right? Which you always need to be a good scientist. So I think that's the key message. You have to be curious enough, but you have to become a very good disciplinary scientist. And then when you set up these projects, you need 2 ingredients. First of all, I think you need somebody who is accepted in the community that you are reaching. You need trust, right? To get stakeholders interested in what you want to do. It's really hard if you don't have the trust of the people. So in some sense, if you are from the community, it's easier to develop those more practical projects, right? And then the team you form needs to have a real interest in solving sustainability problems. So I've seen transdisciplinary projects fail because, let's say, a collaborator actually just was interested in the funding, but he wants to do his own thing, disciplinary work, right? That doesn't work. You need to bring people together who have a genuine interest in solving that sustainability problem. If you don't manage that, I think you have a hard time. And the third lesson is, it's really hard for early career researchers. So the project I just showed you had PhDs in it. And I don't know if you might remember, I don't know when you were at IGB, if it was the Besatzfish time, but we had a hard time finishing up the PhD students because, of course, they are usually judged against disciplinary standards, and they only have 3 years of time usually. And if they engage in a participatory process and spend time communicating with people on the ground, that time is lost to the science, right? So I think transdisciplinary works best with postdocs or more established people, and unless you get funding for a long period of time.
Great. Well, another question related to this is just now is, what do you think is missing in the system or in the research career to facilitate such transdisciplinary research? So, I mean, I think the question is about, do you think the governments, the responsible for the management should create these transdisciplinary projects and no the scientific make projects for the transdisciplinary research?
Well, I do think, I mean, this is at two levels. I think at the first level, a big barrier to be able to set those experiments up is to have people in the academic system that are willing and able to do that. So there is this big constraint already at the educational system. Who are we educating out of our programs, right? And at least for Germany, I can say most are very disciplinary faculties. You know, you do biology or chemistry or physics, and it's, you know, there's often very little room for giving the people a little bit more than just their biological component. And of course, then you are brainwashed as a person, right? And you think then only in this one stream of thought. So I think governments have to actually facilitate some change in you know, how science is evaluated, how faculties are structured, and maybe foster things like environmental sciences or sustainability sciences as a discipline, like something that's equally accepted as the classical disciplines. That's the first. And the second is, of course, the funding of projects, and that's what you were referring to. I was lucky enough that Germany actually set up these programs. They were called Program for Social Ecological Research, a young scientist group to study social ecological problems. So, and they were 5 years in time, not just 3. And they were actually meant to generate a new, generation of thinkers that actually want to do transdisciplinary work and get the resources to do so. And then you need the managers to actually say, hey, we need that too. You know, we cannot solve our local overfishing problem without this type of project, right? So you need to have that willingness also on the side of the managers to come on board on these projects. Otherwise, it's an academic exercise and then it doesn't work again. So.
Another audience from Uruguay, which is great, is asking about the cost. So how much costs a transdisciplinary project in comparison with a traditional project? I know that it's not the same, but this work of doing, for example, the workshops, this work of doing so many surveys is how much is the cost of this kind of project?
Yeah, I mean, this is really hard to answer in one sentence because, I mean, for example, there was 12 projects in that generation where I was funded there were 12 projects, and they were running from 800,000 euro over 5 years to 2.5 million euro, and it simply is on the different domains, right? So I was doing genetics and big surveys, and so there were these costs that maybe other projects don't have. I don't think they have to be necessarily expensive, but what I do think is that they can only be successful if you have funding for a dedicated staff that manages the communication, first of all. It's nothing that the PhD students or me can do as full-time job. It's a full-time job to keep people engaged. So you need somebody for that, and you need enough resources for meetings. And Zoom, it will be hard to do this on Zoom. I don't know the new normal what will happen, but you need the meeting rooms, right? And you need a moderator because you will lose you cannot be the moderator yourself. You know, you are part of the discussion group. You are not independent, right? So you need a neutral person, and that costs resources. And I have the experience that very often, unfortunately, even in the funding and the European Union level, you have, okay, you should do interdisciplinary work. And then you have like 10 ecologists, and then they call one social scientist. By the way, could you also come on board? But you don't have any funding, or you have very little or something. And for outreach, there's 50,000 euro. You know, that doesn't work. It must be transdisciplinary means that the work packages have to be designed in a way that this interaction fostering is equally rewarded as is the actual science. right? And then it really depends on what you want to do with it. How exactly.
Yeah, but this question comes to me because, okay, what about transdisciplinary research in these times that we are living with the COVID and those? What's your opinion about that?
Yeah.
Because
it's very hard, and the project I just talked about, this coastal pike project is suffering. It's suffering. You know, we have a working group, and you know how humans are. You know, to build relationships, you have to regularly meet, and it's, you know, you have to meet. I mean, this is how we humans are structured. Otherwise, you know, something happens with your brain. I don't know, but you have to meet, and Zoom is simply not a substitute, especially if you don't know the people very well. So, yes, I think this type of work we did there on the stocking would simply be impossible under a very prolonged COVID time.
So yeah, another question is, well, okay, you had this project in Germany where you have this very good structure of the system, because these clubs are in association, this hierarchical structure. What do you think of implementing those kind of approaches to non-structured places or systems? Like in Spain, for example, the recreational fishery is not structured at all, and there's any solution for whenever your system is not an structured system?
Well, yeah, it makes things substantially more complicated because the human dynamics are less under control, right? So, and again, I know exactly what you're talking about, because I have now the direct comparison of the stocking project I presented and the habitat enhancement project, which is in this context, and the coastal project, which is in this open context, right? So in this coastal fishery we are currently working on, you have guides, angling guides, you have normal anglers, you have tourists, you have nature conservationists and commercial fishermen. None of them are really organized or have functional organizations. And then it's substantially more difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's more difficult for two reasons. The first reason is the angling club case is great because there is a property right in place, right? So the anglers are managing their lake. So they have a very strong interest, intrinsic motivation to learn how they could do things better because it's their system. When you move to a coastal fishery, well, they do not stock, right? The people are users of the ecosystem, but they are not managers of the ecosystem. And changes the incentive structure, because often scientists might then be perceived as somebody who, in the end, want to introduce a new MPA, marine protected area, and prohibit fishing, you know, and then people start to talk and are afraid that maybe the science can change my access to the resource and so on. So I don't have a good solution other than to say, try to develop organizations whenever you can, so there is some structure. It's very important to have those in place, or at least it helps to reach people. And secondly, you probably need much more time to develop trust. I don't think it's impossible, but with the right project leader, you can still generate good cooperation, mark recapture experiments and so on in an open system. But it's more difficult. You probably need even more resources to keep people under communication, right? And to avoid that they leave the project because they are now afraid of something, or there's some rumor coming up. And then it's very easy to flee if you are an independent person. If you are representing an organization, it's very difficult because they are representing many others who then tell you, why did you leave, right? So organization first, secondly, trust building, but more difficult.
Yeah. So we have a little bit more time for two more questions. One, most of the audience comes from marine fisheries, and they ask, what is the difference? Well, I think you are familiar with the co-management of small-scale fisheries. So what are the differences between your approach, this idea of applying transdisciplinary research to natural resources, with the co-management strategies and with the ecosystem-based management? Or they are the same, but we are speaking in another language, or one is more focused on engaging people to the research, or
Yeah, I don't see, I mean, except of the property rights that I just told you about, our systems, the inland systems have a private fishing rights system. Your co-management system is usually a public resource, right? Where there is I don't think it's owned by the local fishers, but it's usually an agency or somebody who is tasked to manage that resource, and then you bring people on board for motivating the decisions, but it's still a public resource. So it's a governance system difference, first of all, and it's a scale difference. I mean, if you have an open system, fish can go away and flee and so on. But I think that's only a structural difference. A major third difference could be that if you talk about ecosystem-based management, it's often still ecosystem-oriented, right? While the approach we are taking is a social ecological perspective. So the benefits that fishing has for people is equally important than avoiding the negative impacts debate. So it's a little bit of a different ideology or moral that guides those discussions, right? The overall principles of engaging people, keeping them in workshop settings, jointly discussing about what to do, I think hold as long as in your community. So my argument would be in the community-based setting, I would always try to give people sovereignty to motivate the decisions. So in other words, that they are not just informed about what ecosystem-based management wants to do next, but they are part of this, of saying where the MPA will be and what the limits are on gear or whatever, and that the agencies that ultimately make the decision actually then say, yes, this is what the people decided. And then they accept that decision. I think this would increase the cooperation and the willingness to take part substantially, because they are no longer, the people are no longer perceived as just being informed or as a discussant, but they have some power to make their local rules. And I think that's very important to people, that they have that feeling.
Yeah, and the last question, and also just like a final message of your talk. So what are the differences between citizen science and transdisciplinary research in just one or two shots?
Again, citizen science comes in many different variants, and transdisciplinary research comes in many different variants. So in the end, the variants could be the same, but I'm just saying how I perceive it right now. I perceive the citizen science community more as working on that lower level of that participation circle that I showed. Basically, very often, it's very often motivated by this bird research, like observations. How do we collect observations from people, right? That are swimming there or angling, and then they see an invasive species, or now we all go out and count the birds or something. All great stuff, but it's the feedback side. The people are contributing data. And then a scientist says, great, I have data, can produce better maps and so on. Very often, this is the reality of citizen science projects. And what I think transdisciplinary is not saying that the people are informants, but people are they are scientists. They are really scientists in a sense that they have a question. They help structure the research problem. What are we going to study? What are the hypotheses? How do I interpret the result that you scientists show me, the graph? That you sit together and you interpret it. Is it an increase, a decrease? How do we deal with uncertainties? And then also, what do we do next? So it's really that it's a co-production of knowledge that transdisciplinary is. You work on an eye level, and each brings their own competencies. We as a scientist, we are no different than anybody else, other than we use a different set of methods. We have a more structured way at getting at truth, right? It's just replicable, maybe. But a person on the street that deals with the ecosystem also has knowledge, and is probably equally valid as your knowledge. It's just done by other methods. So in that sense, you are a partner at the same eye level. And that's different to the citizen science, where often you have somebody who's interested in data and says, please help me. And I think that's simply just completely different approach to bringing people on board.
Yeah. So I think we can stop here. So Robert, thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting, very inspiring. So we are still over 60, 70 persons. So we are not alone. So thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. So see you.
Thank you, everybody.